So let's talk further on nutrition and chronic disease prevention, further exploring the foods that we probably want to limit or avoid if we're really making an attempt to avoid chronic disease. So these are going to be your processed foods primarily to limit and avoid. If we can think of foods that come out of a box, bag, or a can, and they have a lot of added ingredients, such as snack foods, sweets, baked goods, processed meats like bacon, sausage, lunch meats, red meats such as beef and pork. Also, thinking of all those pre-packaged foods that might be highly refined, highly processed, that are convenience kind of foods. Sure, they taste good, they're quick and easy, but from a nutrition standpoint are really devoid of those nutrients that help us to be healthy and well and vibrant. And unfortunately have a lot of those added ingredients that can be detrimental to our health, like added fat, added sugar, added salt, and added preservatives. So thinking of things like frozen pizzas, bagged and boxed meals of all different kinds of varieties. From a very general perspective, we want to try to eat foods that are in as close to their natural state as possible, as frequently or more of the norm of our diet. So if we can pull a food off of a tree or a bush or pluck it out of the ground, wash it and cook it and eat it, that's really the best case scenario. So we've just touched on foods that we should try to limit or avoid in the efforts towards prevention of chronic disease. Now let's touch on the foods that we do want to increase or consume more freely in a healthy diet that is going to help us prevent chronic disease. So we want to increase the consumption of whole plant foods. Again, those are the foods that come already packaged with lots of the nutrients that we need to sustain health. So of course, we're looking at things like fruits and vegetables. It's recommended to get at least 5 servings a day between the two of them. Nuts and legumes, 3 to 4 servings a week. Again, these are loaded with fiber and minerals and nutrients that we need. Whole grains as well, things like oatmeal, brown rice, quinoa, whole grain bread, popcorn, up to 3 servings daily. So again, these are the foods that are nutritionally dense and naturally health promoting. So we certainly don't have to eat these foods perfectly at every meal, and no one's perfect. So we're I'm prone to that as well in terms of grabbing an occasional frozen pizza or something that's quick and convenient. But if we can start to skew our diet more towards these health promoting foods and focus on their simple preparation, that's going to certainly be something that can help us in our efforts at avoiding chronic disease. So let's switch focus now and discuss exercise and chronic disease prevention. So this statistic here is from the World Health Organization. Sedentary lifestyles increase all causes of morbidity, double the risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. Sedentary lifestyles also increase the risk for cancer, high blood pressure, osteoporosis, depression, and anxiety. Even 1 hour per week of moderate physical activity can reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke by 20%. So we'll touch next on what types of exercise we should be doing and at what amount in order to best reap the benefits of exercise that we can get in terms of chronic disease prevention. Exercise and chronic disease prevention. So the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that we get upwards of 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise. So that could be something as simple as brisk walking, or doing lightweight training, or riding an elliptical machine at a moderate pace, or 75 minutes of vigorous exercise or activities. Vigorous is increasing that intensity level. We can think of something vigorous, which might be doing running or jogging at a decent pace. Or we might do interval training where we are doing an exercise very intensely for a short span of time, followed by a resting period or a moderate level of intensity for a brief period of time, followed again by that more intense bout of exercise. Again, we're getting the heart rate very elevated, and that would certainly be a more vigorous form of exercise. The American College of Sports Medicine also recommends 2 to 3 days per week of resistance training activities. These are muscle strengthening activities. You could think of this as doing body weight exercises or lifting weights as well. The American College of Sports Medicine also recommends variety in activities to include flexibility type exercises. So stretching might be included there, balance type exercises, and certainly weight-bearing exercises as well. Another important aspect of being active is just trying to move more and sit less in our daily life. Just being more active, being up and moving about more during our general day. Whether we're doing structured exercise or not, this is something that can help tremendously. And of course, I always recommend and remind people any amount of physical activity is better than nothing at all. Even if you're doing a half hour to an hour per week of structured exercise, you're going to get some benefits from that activity. Intermediate risk factors. So we touched on some common modifiable risk factors, things such as eating an unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, and tobacco use. And we just spent a decent amount of time discussing what is a healthy diet and how do we eat to prevent chronic disease, as well as how can exercise help us prevent chronic disease. We also touched on those non-modifiable risk factors such as age, heredity, gender even as well. So if we're not taking any steps to take care of ourselves in terms of diet and exercise, stress management, being a non-tobacco user, those sorts of things, we may see the rise of intermediate risk factors, things like blood pressure, raised blood glucose, abnormal lipids, being overweight or being obese. So these are some certain signs and symptoms that the disease progress is continuing. So we'll touch base on some of those intermediate risk factors in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about weight as an intermediate risk factor. So the body mass index is one of the most widely utilized classification tools for weight. It runs from 18.5, which is considered normal, through 40 and over, which is morbidly obese. So for a normal weight, we'd like to see that between 18.5 and 24.9. And then you see the values and the ranges for being overweight, for being obese, severely obese, and morbidly obese. So overweight and obese individuals have a 2 to 3 times increased risk of coronary artery disease and hypertension, and a 10-fold increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So there's a very clear and consistent risk pattern with being overweight or obese, being very closely linked to things like heart disease, diabetes, even certain forms of cancer. So now let's discuss blood pressure as an intermediate risk factor. So certainly increased blood pressure, hypertension, can be a sign that that disease process is already taking place in the body. So we look at a normal blood pressure of less than 120 on the systolic, that top number, and less than 80 of the diastolic, or the bottom number. So in this graphic here, we'll break down what's considered elevated high blood pressure, stage 1, stage 2, and hypertensive crisis mode. So again, if we're taking the necessary steps from a lifestyle standpoint, eating a healthy diet, exercising, these are some steps we can take to avoid increasing blood pressure and also limit our risk factors for heart disease altogether, because increasing blood pressure is a sign, an early onset sign of heart disease. So now we'll touch on intermediate risk factors such as lipids. So cholesterol and triglycerides have long been established as a risk factor for not only heart disease, but type 2 diabetes if they become and remain elevated over time. This can contribute to arteriosclerosis, or that thickening and hardening of the arteries. Elevated triglycerides are also associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So this graphic here kind of breaks down what the desirable ranges are for cholesterol and the various components such as HDL and LDL, as well as triglycerides. And we'll also show you the borderline and high risk areas of cholesterol and triglycerides. So again, if we're watching our diet, if we're moving our bodies, these are surefire steps we can take to control our lipids over time. Blood glucose as an intermediate risk factor. So blood glucose's normal value, fasting in the morning, is between 65 and 99. Pre-diabetic ranges are between 100 and 125, and then anything greater than 125 is considered to be potentially a diabetic level. Fasting glucose, as it becomes more elevated over time, increases the risk for diabetes, and diabetics unfortunately have a 2 to 3 times increased risk factor for heart disease. So again, if we're moving our body, if we're staying active, if we're eating a healthy diet, that can certainly help us control our blood sugar and over time limit the risk of diabetes and other associated conditions. Metabolic syndrome and chronic disease. So metabolic syndrome is considered to be a cluster of biochemical and physiological abnormalities associated with the development of chronic disease. So if we exhibit 3 or more of these 5 risk factors, visceral obesity, insulin resistance or glucose issues, hypertension, high triglycerides, or low HDL, this significantly increases our overall risk for heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, and other inflammatory conditions. So again, if we're taking care of ourselves from a diet standpoint, if we're being active, if we're managing stress, these are all things that can help us avoid metabolic syndrome and all the other associated diseases. So let's talk about some keys to early detection and prevention. So of course, we want to do all those things that we can do from a dietary standpoint, from an exercise standpoint, stress management standpoint, to prevent chronic disease. But we also want to, of course, have a great relationship with our primary care physician. We want to see that person regularly, and we want to stay up on regular screenings and checkups. All the statistics will show that individuals that have a primary care physician, their health outcomes are generally better than individuals who do not. And again, we want to stay up on those regular screenings and checkups, annual wellness checkup with a blood draw, screenings for things like breast cancer, cervical cancer, colorectal cancer, and prostate health as well. So chronic disease prevention involves a lot of different factors, and some of them, as we discussed, we can't control, like our age, like our gender, and our genetic makeup. But certainly we do have a lot of control over certain aspects of the development of chronic disease and preventing it. Things like improving our diet, like we discussed, trying to include more whole plant-based foods, and avoiding some of those processed foods and too many animal-based foods in our diet. Certainly moving more, it all counts. That exercise makes a big difference. Managing weight over time to stay in a healthy weight range. Taking steps to control stress. Ditching tobacco products. Drinking in moderation or not at all. And of course, engaging with your primary care provider and taking advantage of preventive screenings to make sure that we're catching conditions early on. Thank you so much for joining me on this discussion of chronic disease prevention. If you have any questions, please do let me know. My email address, bob@thrivewellnessinc.com. Thanks again and have a great day.